Welcome on in, welcome in. Sit back, relax as we continue with our reading of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, and selected by W.B. Yeats. The Stolen Child by W.B. Yeats. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuth Wood in the lake, there lies a leafy island, where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the woods and waters wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim grey sands with light, far off by furthest roses we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has taken flight. To and fro we leap and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles, and is anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the woods and waters wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glencar, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, we give them evil dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears of dew on the young streams. Come, O human child, to the woods and waters wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the woods and waters wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand. Right. This next section dealing with the trooping fairies. Let's see. The Marrow, or if you write it in Irish, oh, this is gonna be bad. Merod, or Morogak, from moor, sea, and oik, a maid, is not uncommon, they say, on the wilder coasts. The fishermen do not like to see them, for it always means coming the gales. The male Marrows, if you can use such a phrase, I've never heard the masculine of Marrow, have green teeth, green hair, pig's eyes, and red noses, but their women are beautiful, for all their fish tails and the little duck-like scales between their fingers. Sometimes they prefer small blame to them, a good-looking fisherman to their sea lovers. Near Bantry in the last century, there is said to have been a woman covered all over with scales like a fish, who was descended from such a marriage. Sometimes they come out to the sea and wander about the shore in the shape of little hornless cows. They have, when in their own shape, a red cap, called the Coholin Druith, usually covered with feathers. If this is stolen, they cannot go down under the waves. Red is the color of magic in every country, and have been so from the very earliest times. The caps of fairies and magicians are well nigh always red. The Soul Cages by T. Crofton Croker. Jack Dougherty lived on the coast of the County Clare. Jack was a fisherman, as his father and grandfather before him had been. Like them, too, he lived all alone, but for the wife and just in the same spot. People used to wonder why the Dougherty family were so fond of that wild situation. So far away from all humankind, and in the midst of huge scattered rocks, with nothing but the wide ocean to look upon. But they had their own good reasons for it. The place was just the only spot on that part of the coast where anybody could well live. There was a neat little creek, where a boat might lie as snug as a puffin in her nest, and out from this creek a ledge of sunken rocks ran into the sea. Now when the Atlantic, according to custom, was raging with a storm, and a good westerly wind was blowing strong on the coast, many a richly laden ship went to pieces on these rocks, and then the fine bales of cotton and tobacco and such like things, and the pipes of wine and the puncheons of rum, and the casks of brandy and the kegs of Hollands that used to come ashore. Dunbeg Bay was just like a little estate to the Doughertys. Not but they were kind and humane to a distressed sailor, if ever one had the good luck to get to land, and many a time indeed did Jack put out his little curragh, which, though not quite equal to honest Andrew Hennessy's canvas lifeboat, would breast the billows like any gannet, to lend a hand towards bringing off the crew from a wreck. But when the ship had gone to pieces and the crew were all lost, who would blame Jack for picking up all he could find? "And who is the worse of it?" said he. "For as to the king, God bless him, everybody knows he's rich enough already without getting what's floating in the sea." Jack, though such a hermit, was a good-natured jolly fellow. No other shore could ever have coaxed Biddy Mahoney to quit her father's snug and warm house in the middle of town of Ennis, and to go so many miles off to live among the rocks with the seals and seagulls for next-door neighbors. But Biddy knew that Jack was the man for a woman who wished to be comfortable and happy. For to say nothing of the fish, Jack had the supplying of half the gentlemen's houses of the county with the godsends that came into the bay. And she was right in her choice, for no woman ate, drank, or slept better, or made a prouder appearance at chapel on Sundays than Mrs. Dougherty. Many a strange sight, it may well be supposed, did Jack see, and many a strange sound did he hear, but nothing daunted him. So far was he from being afraid of marrows or such beings, that the very first wish of his heart was to fairly meet with one. Jack had heard that they were mighty like Christians, and that luck had always come out of an acquaintance with them. Never before did he dimly discern the marrows moving along the face of the waters in their robes of mist, but he made direct for them, and many a scolding did Biddy in her own quiet way bestow upon Jack for spending his whole day out at sea and bringing home no fish. Little did poor Biddy know that the fish Jack was after. It was rather annoying to Jack that though living in a place where the barrows were as plenty as lobsters, he never could get a right view of one. What vexed him more was that both his father and grandfather had often seen them, and he often remembered hearing, when a child, knew his grandfather, who was the first of the family that had settled down at the creek, had been so intimate with Merrill that, only for fear of vexing the priest, he would have had him stand for one of his children. This, however, Jack did not well know how to believe. Fortune at length began to think that it was only right that Jack should know as much as his father and grandfather did. Accordingly, one day when he had strolled a little farther than usual along the coast to the northward, just as he turned a point, he saw something, like to nothing he had never seen before, perched upon a rock at a little distance out to sea. It looked green in the body, as well as he could discern at that distance, and would have sworn, only the thing was impossible, that it had a cocked hat in its hand. Jack stood for a good half-hour straining his eyes and wondering at it, and all the time the thing did not stir hand or foot. At last, Jack's patience was quite worn out, and he gave a loud whistle and a hail, when the marrow, for such as it was, started up, put the cocked hat on its head, and dived down, head foremost from the rock. Jack's curiosity was now excited, and he constantly directed his steps toward the point. Still, he could never get a glimpse of the sea gentleman with the cocked hat, and with thinking about the matter, he began at last to fancy he had been only dreaming. One very rough day, however, when the sea was running mountains high, Jack Dougherty determined to get a look at the Marrow's Rock, for he had always chosen a fine day before, and then he saw the strange thing cutting capers upon the top of the rock, and then diving down, and then coming up, and then diving down again. Jack had now only to choose his time, that is, a good blowing day, and he might see the man of the sea as often as he pleased. All this, however, did not satisfy him. Much will have more. He wished now to get acquainted with the Merrill, and even in this he succeeded. One tremendous blustering day before he got to the point whence he had a view of the Merrill's rock, the storm came on so furiously that Jack was obliged to take shelter in one of the caves, which are so numerous along the coast, and there, to his astonishment, he saw sitting before him a thing with green hair, long green teeth, a red nose, and pig's eyes. It had a fish's tail, legs with scales in them, and short arms like fins. It wore no clothes, but had the cocked hat under its arm, and seemed engaged, thinking very seriously about something. Jack, with all his courage, was a little daunted, but now or never, thought he. So up he went boldly to the cogitating fishman, took off his hat, and made his best bow. "Your servant, sir," said Jack. "Your servant kindly, Jack Dougherty," answered the Merrill. "To be sure, then. How well your honor knows my name," said Jack. Is it I not know your name, Jack Dougherty?" "Why, man, I knew your grandfather long before he was married to Judy Regan. Your grandmother." Jack, I was fond of that grandfather of yours. He was a mighty worthy man in his time. I never met his match above or below, before or since, for sucking in a shellful of brandy. I hope, my boy," said the old fellow with a merry twinkle in his eyes, "I hope you're his own grandson." Never fear me for that," said Jack. "If my mother had only reared me on brandy, 'tis myself that would be a sucking infant to this hour." "Well, I'd like to hear you talk so manly. You and I must be better acquainted, if it were only for your grandfather's sake. But Jack, that father of yours was not the thing. He had no head at all." "I'm sure," said Jack, "since your honor lives down under the water, you must be obliged to drink a power to keep anyone such a cruel, damp, cold place. Well, I've often heard of Christians drinking like fishes, and might I be so bold as to ask where you get the spirits?" "Where do you get them yourself, Jack?" said the Merrill, twitching his red nose between his forefinger and thumb. "Hubba-boo," cries Jack. "Now I see how it is, but I suppose, sir, your honor has got a fine dry cellar below to keep them in." "Let me alone for the cellar," said the Merrill with a knowing wink of his left eye. "I'm sure," continued Jack, "it must be mighty well worth the looking at." "You may say that, Jack," said the Merrill, "and if you meet me here next Monday, just at this time of day, we will have a little more talk with one another about the matter." Jack and the Merrill parted the best friends in the world. On Monday they met, and Jack was not a little surprised to see that the Merrill had 2 cocked hats with him, one under each arm. "Might I take the liberty you ask, sir," said Jack, "why your honor has brought the 2 hats with you today?" "You would not, so ought sure be going to give me one of them to keep for the curiosity of the thing." No, Jack," said he. "I don't get my hats so easily to part with them that way. But I want you to come down and dine with me, and I brought you the hat to dine with." "Lord bless and preserve us," cried Jack. Amazement. "Would you want me to go down to the bottom of the salt sea ocean? Sure, I'd be smothered and choked up with the water, to say nothing of being drowned. And what would poor Biddy do for me? What would she say?" "And what matters what she says, you Pinkeen? Who cares for Biddy's squalling? Long before your grandfather would have talked in that way. Many's the time he stuck that same hat on his head and dived down boldly after me, and many's the snug bit of dinner and good shellful of brandy he and I had together below under the water. Is it really, sir, and no joke?" Jack. "Why then, sorrow me forever and a day after, if I'll be a worse man nor my grandfather was. Here goes, but play me fair now. Here's neck or nothing," cried Jack. "That's your grandfather all over," said the old fellow. "So come along then, and do as I do." They both left the cave, walked into the sea, and then swam a piece until they got to the rock. The Merrill climbed to the top of it, and Jack followed him. On the far side it was as straight as the wall of a house, and the sea beneath looked so deep that Jack was almost cowed. "Now, do you see, Jack?" said the Merrill. "Just put this hat on your head. and mind to keep your eyes wide open. Take hold of my tail and follow after me, and you'll see what you'll see." In he dashed, and in dashed Jack after him boldly. They went, and Jack thought they'd never stop going. Many a time did he wish himself sitting at home by the fireside with Biddy. Yet where was the use of wishing now, when he was so many miles, as he thought, below the waves of the Atlantic? Still he held hard by the Merrow's tail, slippery as it was. At last, to Jack's great surprise, they got out of the water, and he actually found himself on dry land at the bottom of the sea. They landed just in front of a nice house that was slated very neatly with oyster shells, and the Merrow, turning down to Jack, welcomed him down. Jack could hardly speak, what with wonder and with being out of breath with traveling so fast through the water. He looked about him, and could see no living things, barring crabs and lobsters, of which there were plenty walking leisurely about on the sand. Overhead was the sea like a sky, and the fishes like birds swimming about in it. "Why don't you speak, man?" said the Earl. "Dare say you had notion that I had such a snug little concern here as this. Are you smothered or choked or drowned, or are you fretting after Biddy, eh?" "Oh, not myself indeed," said Jack, showing his teeth with a good-humoured grin. "Who in the world would ever have thought of seeing such a thing? Now come along, and let us see what they've got for us to eat." Jack really was hungry, and it gave him no small pleasure to perceive a fine column of smoke rising from the chimney, announcing what was going on within. Into the house he followed the Merrow, and there he saw a good kitchen, right well provided with everything. There was a noble dresser, and plenty of pots and pans, with 2 young Merrows cooking. His host then led him into the room, which was furnished shabbily enough. Not a table or chair was there in it, nothing but planks and logs of wood to sit on and eat off. There was, however, a good fire blazing upon the hearth, a comfortable sight to Jack. "Come now, and I'll show you where I keep you know what," said the Merrow with a sly look, and opening a little door, he led Jack into a fine cellar, well filled with pipes and kegs and hogsheads and barrels. "What do you say to that, Jack Doherty? Maybe a body can't live snug under the water." "Never the doubt of that," said Jack, with a convincing smack of his underlip, that he really thought what he said. Then he went to the room and found dinner laid. There was no tablecloth, to be sure, but what matter? It was not always Jack had one at home. The dinner would have been no discredit to the first house of the country on a fast day. The choicest of fish, and no wonder was there. Turbots and sturgeons and soles and lobsters and oysters and 20 other kinds were on the planks at once, and plenty of the best of foreign spirits. The wines, the old fellow said, were too cold for his stomach. Jack ate and drank till he could eat no more. Then, taking up a shell of brandy, "Here's to your honour's good health, sir," said he, "though begging your pardon, it's mighty odd that as long as acquainted I don't know your name yet." "That's true, Jack," replied he. "I never thought of it before, but better late than never. My name's Kumara." "And a mighty decent name it is," cried Jack, taking another shellful. "Here's to your good health, Kumara, and may ye live these 50 years to come." 50 years, repeated Kumara. "I'm obliged to you indeed. If you had said 500, it would have been something worth the wishing." "By the law, sir," cries Jack, you lived to a powerful age here under the water. You knew my grandfather, and he's dead, and gone better than these 60 years. Sure it must be a healthy place to live in. No doubt of it, but come, Jack, keep the liquor stirring." Shell after shell did he empty, and to Jack's exceeding surprise, he found the drink never got into his head, owing, I suppose, to the sea being over them, which kept their noddles cool. Old Kumara got exceedingly comfortable and sung several songs, but Jack, if his life had depended on it, could never remember more than "Rum fum boodle boo, ripple dipple niddy dob, dum doo doodle coo, raffle taffle chitty boo." It was the chorus to one of them, and to say the truth, nobody that I know has ever been able to pick out any particular meaning out of it. But that, to be sure, is the case with many a song nowadays. At length said he to Jack, "Now, my dear boy, if you follow me, I'll show you my curiosities." He opened a little door, and led Jack into a large room, where Jack saw a great many odds and ends that Kumara had picked up at one time or another. What chiefly took his attention, however, were things like lobster pots ranging on the ground along the wall. "Well, Jack, how do you like my curiosities?" said old Ku. "Upon my salkins, sir," said Jack, "they're mighty well worth the looking at, but might I trouble as to ask what these things like lobster pots are?" "Oh, the soul cages, is it?" "The what, sir?" "These things here that I keep the souls in." "What souls, sir?" said Jack in amazement. "Sure the fish have no souls in them." "Oh, no," replied Ku quite coolly. "That they have not, but these are the souls of drowned sailors." "The Lord preserve us from all harm," muttered Jack. "How in the world did you get them?" "Easily enough. I've only, when I see a good storm coming on, to set a couple of dozen of these, and then, when the sailors are drowned and the souls get out of them under the water, the poor things are almost perished to death, not being used to the cold. So they make into my pots for shelter, and then I have them snug and fetch them home, and keep them here dry and warm, and it's not well for them, poor souls, to get into such good quarters." Jack was so thunderstruck, he did not know what to say, so he said nothing. Then he went back into the dining room and had a little more brandy, which is excellent, and then as Jack knew that it must be getting late, and as Biddy might be uneasy, he stood up and said he thought it was time for him to be on the road. "Just as you like, Jack," said Ku, "but take you a ducat Honduras before you go. You've a cold journey before you." Jack knew better manners than to refuse the parting glass. "I wonder, said he, will I be able to make out my way home?" "What should ail you?" said Ku, "and I'll show you the way." Out they went before the house, and Kumara took one of the cocked hats and put it upon Jack's head the wrong way, and then lifted him up on his shoulder that he might launch him into the water. "Now," says he, giving him a heave, "you'll come up just in the same spot you came down in, and Jack, mind and throw me the hat back." He canted Jack off his shoulder, and up he shot like a bubble, whir is. Away he went through the water, till he came to the very rock he had jumped off, where he found a landing place, and then in he threw the hat, which sunk like a stone. The sun was going down in the beautiful sky of a calm summer evening. Fescor was seen dimly twinkling in the cloudless heaven, a solitary star, and then the waves of the Atlantic flashed in a golden flood of light. So Jack, perceiving it was late, set off home, but when he got there, not a word did he say to Biddy of where he had spent his day. The state of the poor souls cooped up in the lobster pots gave Jack a great deal of trouble, and how to release them cost him a great deal of thought. He at first had mind to speak to the priest about the matter, but what could the priest do? And what did Ku care for the priest? Besides, Ku was a good sort of old fellow, and he did not think he was doing any harm. Jack had a regard for him, too, and it also might not be to his own credit if it were known that he used to dine with the Marrows. On the whole, he thought his best plan would be to ask Ku to dinner and to make him drunk, if he was able, and then to take the hat and go down and turn up the pots. It was first of all necessary, however, to get Biddy out of the way, for Jack was prudent enough, as she was a woman, to wish to keep the thing secret from her. Accordingly, Jack grew mighty pious all of a sudden, and said to Biddy that he thought it would be good for the good of both their souls if she was to go and take her rounds at St. John's Well near Ennis. Biddy thought so too, and accordingly off she set one fine morning at day dawn, giving Jack a strict charge to have an eye to the place. The coast being clear, away went Jack to the rock, which gave the appointed signal to Kumara, which was throwing a big stone into the water. Jack threw, and up sprang Ku. "Good morning, Jack," said he. "What do you want with me?" "Just nothing at all to speak about, sir," returned Jack. "Would it come and take a bit of dinner with me if I might make so free as to ask you now? And sure, I'm now after doing so." "It's quite agreeable, Jack, I assure you. What's your hour?" "Any time that's most convenient to you, sir. Say 1 o'clock, that you may go home if you wish with the daylight." "I'll be with you," said Ku. "Never fear me." Jack went home, and dressed a noble fish dinner, and got out plenty of his best foreign spirits, enough, for that matter, to make 20 men drunk. Just to the minute came Ku with his cocked hat under his arm. Dinner was ready. They sat down and ate and drank away manfully. Jack, thinking of the poor souls below in the pots, plied old Ku well with brandy, encouraged him to sing, hoping to put him under the table, but poor Jack forgot he had not the sea over his own head to keep it cool. The brandy got into it, and he did his business for him, and Ku reeled off home, leaving his entertainer as dumb as a haddock on a Good Friday. Jack never woke till the next morning, and then he was in a sad way. "It's no use for me thinking to make that old rapparee drunk," said Jack. "How in this world can I help the poor souls out of the lobster pots?" After ruminating nearly the whole day, a thought struck him. "I have it," says he, slapping his knee. "They sworn that Ku never saw a drop of poteen, as old as he is, and that's the thing to settle him. It's not well that Biddy will not be home these 2 days yet. I have another twist at him." Asked Ku again, and Ku laughed at him for having no better head, telling him he'd come up to his grandfather. "Well, but try me," said Jack, "and I'll be able to drink you drunk and sober and drunk again. Anything in my powers, Ku, to oblige you." At this dinner, Jack took care to have his own liquor well watered, to give the strongest brandy he had to Ku. At last says he, "Sir, do you ever drink any poteen, any real Mountain Dew?" "No," says Ku. "What's that, and where's it from?" "That's a secret," said Jack. "But it's the right stuff. Never believe me again, if 'tis not 50 times as good as brandy or rum either. Biddy's brother just sent me a present of a little drop, exchange for some brandy, and as you're an old friend of the family, I kept it to treat you with." "Well, let's see what sort of thing it is," said Kumara. The poteen was the right sort. It was first rate, and had the real smack upon it. Ku was delighted. He drank and he sung "Rum Bum Boodle Boo" over and over, and he laughed and he danced, till he fell on the floor fast asleep. Then Jack, who had taken good care to keep himself sober, snapped up the cocked hat, ran off to the rock, leapt in, and soon arrived at Ku's habitation. All was as still as a churchyard at midnight. Not a marrow, old or young, was there. In he went and turned up the pots, but nothing did he see. Only he heard a sort of a little whistle or chirp as he raised each of them. At this he was surprised, till he recollected what the priest had often said, that nobody living could see the soul, no more than they could see the wind or the air. Having now done all that he could do for them, he set the pots as they were before, and said a blessing after the poor souls to speed them on their journey wherever they were going. Jack now began to think of returning. He put the hat on as was right, the wrong way, but when he got out he found the water so high over his head that he had no hopes of ever going up into it, now that he had not old Kumara to give him a lift. He walked in about looking for a ladder. Not one could he find, and not a rock was there in sight. At last he saw a spot where the sea hung rather lower than anywhere else, so he resolved to try there. Just as he came to it, a big cod happened to jump down his tail. Jack made a jump and caught hold of it, and the cod, all in amazement, gave a bounce and pulled Jack up. The minute the hat touched the water, away Jack was whisked, and up he shot like a cork, dragging the poor cod that he forgot to let go up with him tail foremost. He got to the rock in no time, and without a moment's delay hurried home, rejoicing in the good deed he had done. But meanwhile there was fine work at home, for our friend Jack had hardly left the house on his soul-freeing expedition when came Biddy from her soul-sipping one to the well. When she entered the house and saw the things lying all on the table for her, "Here's a pretty job," she said. Blackguard of mine, what ill luck I have ever to marry him. He's picked up some vagabond or other while I was praying for the good of his soul, and now they took all the poteen that my own brother gave him, and all the spirits, to be sure, that he was to have sold to his honor." Then hearing an outlandish kind of grunt, she looked down and saw Kumara lying under the table. "The Blessed Virgin help me," shouted she, "if he has not made a real beast of himself. I've often heard of a man making a beast of himself with drink. Oh, honed, Jackany, what will I do with you? Or what will I do without you? How can any decent woman ever think of living with a beast?" Such like lamentations, Biddy rushed out of the house, was going she knew not where, when she heard the well-known voice of Jack singing a merry tune. Glad enough was Biddy to find him safe and sound, and not turned into a thing that was like neither fish nor flesh. Jack was obliged to tell her all, and Biddy, though she had half a mind to be angry with him for not telling her before, owned that he had done a great service to the poor souls. Back they both went, most lovingly, to the house, and Jack wakened up Kumara, and perceiving the old fellow to be rather dull, he bid him not to be cast down, for 'twas many a good man's case. Said it all came of his not being used to the poteen, and recommended him, by way of cure, to swallow a bit of the hair of the dog that bit him. Coo, however, seemed to think he had quite enough. He got up, quite out of sorts, and without having the manners to say one word in the way of civility, he sneaked off to cool himself by a jaunt through the salt water. Kumara never missed the souls. He and Jack continued the best friends in the world, and no one perhaps ever equaled Jack for freeing souls from purgatory, for he contrived 50 excuses for getting into the house below the sea, unknown to the old fellow, and then turned up the pots and letting out the souls. It vexed him, to be sure, that he could never see them, but as he knew the thing to be impossible, he was obliged to be satisfied. Their intercourse continued for several years. After one morning, on Jack's throwing in a stone as usual, he got no answer. He flung another, and still there was no reply. He went away and returned the following morning, but it was to no purpose. As he was without the hat, he could not go down to see what had become of old Coo, but his belief was that the old man or the old fish or whatever he was had either died or had removed from that part of the country. Said just into that. 1 second. Oh, let's see. Though it used the term poteen. Is that like... Obviously that's some sort of spirit, but... see. Is a traditional Irish distilled beverage. Former common names for poteen were Irish, moonshine, and Mountain Dew. It was traditionally distilled in a small pot still, and the term is a diminutive of the Irish word pota, meaning pot. In accordance with the Irish poteen technical file, it can only be made from cereals, grain, whey, sugar beet, molasses, and potatoes. Okay. So basically it's Irish moonshine. So there we go, we learned something new. Anyway, next story. Flory Cantillan's Funeral by T. Crofton Croker. The ancient burial place of the Cantillian family was on an island in Ballyhay Bay. This island was situated at no great distance from the shore, and at a remote period was overflowed in one of the encroachments which the Atlantic has made on the part of the coast of Kerry. The fishermen declared they had often seen the ruined walls of an old chapel beneath them in the water, as they sailed over the clear green sea of a sunny afternoon. However this may be, it is well known that the Cantillians were, like most other Irish families, strongly attached to their ancient burial place. This attachment led to the custom, where any of the family died, of carrying the corpse to the seaside, where the coffin was left on the shore within reach of the tide. In the morning it had disappeared, being, as it was traditionally believed, conveyed away by the ancestors of the deceased to their family tomb. Conor Crowe, a County Clare man, was related to the Cantillons by marriage. Conor Mac and Cruach of the Seven Quarters of Brantra, as was commonly called, and a proud man he was of the name. Conor, be it known, would drink a quart of salt water for its medicinal virtues before breakfast, and for the same reason, I suppose, double that quantity of raw whiskey between breakfast and night, which last he did with as little inconvenience to himself as any man in the barony of Moyferta. And were I to add Clanderlaw and Ibrakin, I don't think I should say wrong. On the death of Florence Cantillon, Conor Crowe was determined to satisfy himself about the truth of the story of the old church under the sea. So when he heard the news of the old fellow's death, away with him to Atford, where Flory was laid out in high style, and a beautiful corpse he made. Flory had been as jolly and as rollicking a boy in his day as ever was stretched, and his wake was in every respect worthy of him. There was all kind of entertainment, and all sorts of diversion at it, and no less than 3 girls got husbands there, more luck to them. Everything was as it should be. All that side from the country, from Dingle to Tarbet, was at the funeral. The keen was sung longly and bitterly, and according to the family custom. The coffin was carried to Balhave's strand, where it was laid upon the shore, with a prayer for the repose of the dead. The mourners departed, one group after another. At last Conor Crowe was left alone. He then pulled out his whiskey bottle, his drop of comfort, as he called it, which he required being on grief, and down he sat upon a big stone that was sheltered by a projecting rock, and partly concealed from view, to await with patience the appearance of the ghostly undertakers. The evening came on mild and beautiful. He whistled an old air which he had heard in his childhood, hoping to keep idle fears out of his head, but the wild strain of that melody brought 1,000 recollections with it, which only made the twilight appear more pensive. "If 'twas near the gloomy tower of Dunmore in my own sweet country I was," said Conor Crowe with a sigh, "one might well be believed that the prisoners who were murdered long ago there in the vaults under the castle would be the hands to carry off the coffin out of envy, for never a one of them was buried decently, nor had as much as coffin amongst them all. 'Tis often sure enough I heard lamentations and great mourning coming from the vaults of Dunmore Castle. But," continued he, after fondly pressing his lips to the mouth of his companion and silent comforter, "the whiskey bottle, didn't I know all the time well enough 'twas the dismal sounding waves working through the cliffs and hollows of the rocks, and fretting themselves to foam. Then Dunmore Castle, it is you that are the gloomy looking tower on a gloomy day, with the gloomy hills behind you, when one has gloomy thoughts in their heart, and see you like a ghost rising out of the smoke made by the kelp burners on the strand. There is, the Lord save us, as fearful a look about you as about the Blue Man's Lake at midnight. Well then, anyhow," said Conor after a pause, "is it not a blessed night, though surely the moon looks mighty pale in the face. Saint Sinan himself between us and all kinds of harm." It was in truth a lovely moonlit night. Nothing was to be seen around but the dark rocks and the white pebbly beach, upon which the sea broke with a hoarse and melancholy murmur. Conor, notwithstanding his frequent draughts, felt rather queerish, and almost began to repent his curiosity. It was certainly a solemn sight to behold the black coffin resting upon the white strand. His imagination gradually converted the deep moaning of old ocean into a mournful wail for the dead, and from the shadowy recess of the rocks he imagined 4 strange and visionary forms. As the night advanced, Conor became weary with watching. He caught himself more than once in the act of nodding, when suddenly, giving his head a shake, he would look towards the black coffin, but the narrow house of death remained unmoved before him. It was long past midnight, and the moon was sinking into the sea, when he heard the sound of many voices, which gradually became stronger. Over the heavy and monotonous roll of the sea he listened, and presently could distinguish a keen of exquisite sweetness, the notes of which rose and fell with the heavings of the waves, whose deep murmur mingled and supported the strain. The keen grew louder and louder and seemed to approach the beach. Then fell into a low, plaintive wail. As it ended, Connor beheld a number of strange, in the dim light, mysterious-looking figures emerge from the sea and surround the coffin, which they prepared to launch into the water. "This comes of marrying with the creatures of earth," said one of the figures in a clear yet hollow tone. "True," replied another with a voice of still more fearful. "Our king would never have commanded his gnawing white toothed waves to devour the rocky roots of the island's cemetery had not his daughter, Drusilla, been buried there by her mortal husband." "But the time will come," said a third, bending over the coffin, "when mortal eye our work shall spy, and mortal ear our dirge shall hear." "Then," said a fourth, "our burial of the Cantillans is at an end forever." As this was spoken, the coffin was borne from the beach by a retiring wave, and the company of sea people prepared to follow it. But at that moment one chanced to discover Connor Crowe, at fixed with wonder and as motionless with fear as stone, which he said. "The time is come," cried the unearthly being. "Time is come. A human eye looked on the forms of ocean. A human ear has heard their voices. Farewell to the Cantillans. The sons of the sea are no longer doomed to bury the dust of the earth." One after the other turned slowly round and regarded Connor Crowe, who still remained as if bound by a spell. Again arose their funeral song, and the next wave they followed the coffin. The sound of the lamentation died away. At length nothing was heard but the rush of the waters. The coffin and the train of sea people sank over the old churchyard, and never since the funeral of old Flory Cantillon have any of the family been carried to the strand of Ballyhay for conveyance to their rightful burial place beneath the waves of the Atlantic. Okay, new section. The solitary fairies. Leprechaun, Clurcan, Far Darig. The name Leprechaun, Mr. Douglas Hyde writes to me, is from the Irish Leith Brug, i.e., the one shoemaker, since he is generally seen working at a single shoe. It is spelt in Irish Leithebrugen or Leithfrogen. It is in some places pronounced Lucriman, as O'Kearney writes it in that very rare book, The Face Cheat Conan. I know I'm surely mispronouncing all these absolutely terribly. The leprechaun, Gurkhan, and Far Darig are these one spirit in different moods and shapes? Hardly two Irish writers are agreed. In many things these three fairies, if three, resemble each other. They are withered, old, and solitary, in every way unlike the sociable spirits of the first sections. They dress with all unfairy homeliness, and are indeed most sluttish, slouching, jeering, mischievous phantoms. They are the great practical jokers among the good people. The leprechaun, which makes shoes continually, and has grown very rich, many treasure crocks buried of old in wartime, has he now for his own. In the early part of this century, according to Croker, in a newspaper office in Tipperary, they used to show a little shoe forgotten by a leprechaun. The Cluracan makes himself drunk in gentlemen's cellars. Some suppose he is merely the leprechaun on a spree. He is almost unknown in Connaught and the north. The Far Darig, which means the red man, for he wears a red cap and coat, busies himself with practical joking, especially with gruesome joking. This he does, and nothing else. The Fiergorta, man of hunger, is an emaciated phantom that goes through the land in famine time, begging an alms and bringing good luck to the giver. There are other solitary fairies, such as the house spirit and the water cheery. own brother to the English jack-o'-lantern, the puka and the banshee. Concerning these presently, the Dullahan or headless phantom, one used to stand in the Sligo street on dark nights till lately. The black dog, a form perhaps of the puka. The ships at the Sligo quays are haunted sometimes by this spirit, who announces his presence by a sound like the flinging of all the tin porringers in the world down into the hold. He even follows them to sea. The Lian Huan Shi, fairy mistress, seeks the love of mortals. If they refuse, she must be their slave. If they consent, they are hers, and can only escape by finding another to take their place. The fairy lives on their life, and they waste away. Death is no escape from her. She is the Gaelic muse, for she gives inspiration to those she persecutes. The Gaelic poets die young, for she is restless, and will not let them remain long on the earth, this malignant phantom. Besides thee are diverse monsters, the Alg Iska, the water horse, the Peshta, the lake dragon, and such like, but whether these be animals, fairies, or spirits, I know not. The Leprechaun, or Fairy Shoemaker, by William Allingham. Little cowboy, what have you heard? Up on the lonely raft's green mound, only the plaintive yellow birds eyeing in sultry fields round. Cherry, 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 tea. Only the grasshopper and the bee. Tip-tap, rip-rap, tick-a-tack-too. Scarlet leather sewn together, this will make a shoe. Left-right, pull it tight, summer days are warm. Underground in winter, laughing at the storm. Lay your ear close to the hill, do not catch the tiny clamor. Busy click of an elfin hammer. Voice of the leprechaun singing shrill as he merrily plies his trade. He's a span and a quarter in height. Get him in sight, hold him tight, and you're a made man. You watch your cattle the summer day, sup on potatoes, sleep in the hay. How would you like to roll in your carriage, look for a duchess's daughter in marriage? Seize the shoemaker, then you may. Big boots a-hunting, sandals in the hall, white for a wedding feast, pink for a ball. This way, that way, so we make a shoe, getting rich every stitch, tick-tack-too. 99 treasure crocks, this keen miser fairy hath hid in mountains, woods, and rocks. Ruin in a round tower, cave and wrath, and where the cormorants spilled, from times of old guarded by him, each of them filled full to the brim with gold. I caught him at work one day in myself in the castle ditch where foxglove grows, a wrinkled, wizened, and bearded elf, spectacles stuck on his pointed nose, silver buckles to his hose, leather apron shoe in his lap, rip-rap, tip-tap, tic-tac-too, a grasshopper on my cap. Away the moth flew. Buskins for a fairy prince, brogues for his son. Pay me well, when the job is done. The rogue was mine, beyond a doubt. I stared at him, he stared at me. Servant, sir, says he, and pulled a snuff-box out. He took a long pinch, looked better. Pleased, the queer little leprechaun offered the box with a whimsical grace. Poof, he flung the dust in my face, and while I sneezed was gone. Master and Man, by T. Crofton Croker. Billy McDaniel was once as likely a young man as ever shook his brogue at a patron, emptied a quart or handled a shillelagh, fearing for nothing but the want of drink, caring for nothing but who should pay for it, and thinking of nothing but how to make fun over it. Drunk or sober, a word and a blow was ever the way with Billy McDaniel, and a mighty easy way it is of either a gathering into or of ending a dispute. More is the pity that, through the means of his thinking and fearing and caring for nothing, this same Billy McDaniel fell into bad company, for surely the good people are the worst of all company anyone could come across. It is clear that Billy was going home one clear frosty night not long after Christmas. The moon was round and bright, but although that was as fine a night as heart could wish for, he felt pinched with cold. "By my word," shuddered Billy, "a drop of good liquor would be no bad thing to keep a man's soul from freezing in him, and I wish I had a full measure of the best." "Never wish it twice, Billy," said a little man in a three-cornered hat, bound all about with gold lace and with great silver buckles in his shoes, so big that it was a wonder how he could carry them, and he held out a glass as big as himself, filled with as good liquor as ever eye looked on or tasted. "Success, my little fellow," said Billy McDaniel, nothing daunted, though well he knew the little man to belong to the good people. "Here's to your health, anyway, and thank you kindly. No matter whose pays for the drink," and he took the glass and drained it to the very bottom without ever taking a second breath to it. "Success," said the little man, "and you're heartily welcome, Billy. But don't think to cheat me as you have done others. Out with your purse and pay like a gentleman." "Is it I pay you?" said Billy. "Could I not just take you up and put in my pocket as easily as a blackberry?" "Billy McDaniel," said the little man, getting very angry, "you shall be my servant for 7 years and a day, and that is the way I will be paid, so make ready to follow me." When Billy heard this, he began to very sorry for having used such bold words toward the little man, and he felt himself, yet could not tell how, obliged to follow the little man the livelong night about the country, up and down and over hedge and ditch, and through bog and brake without any rest. When the morning began to dawn, the little man turned to him and said, "You may go now, may go home, Billy, but on your peril don't fail to meet me in the fort field tonight, or if you do it may be the worse for it for you in the long run. If I find you a good servant, you will find me an indulgent master." Home went Billy McDaniel, and though he was tired and weary enough, never a wink of sleep could he get for thinking of the little man, but he was afraid not to do his bidding. So up he got in the evening, and away he went to the fort field. He was not long there before the little man came towards him and said, "Billy, I want to go a long journey tonight, so saddle one of my horses, and you may saddle another for yourself. So you are to go along with me, and may be tired after your walk last night." Billy thought this very considerate of his master, and thanked him accordingly. "But," said he, "maybe so, sir, I would ask which is the way to your stable, for never a thing do I see but the fort here, and the old thorn tree in the corner of the field, and the stream running at the bottom of the hill with the bog over against us." "Ask no questions, Billy," said the little man. "Go over to that bit of bog, and bring me 2 of the strongest rushes you can find." Billy did accordingly, wondering what the little man would be at, and he picked 2 of the stoutest rushes he could find, with a little bunch of brown blossom stuck on the side of each, and brought them back to his master. "Get up, Billy," said the little man, taking one of the rushes from him and striding across it. "Where shall I get up, please, your honor?" "Why, upon horseback like me, to be sure," said the little man. "Is it after making a fool of me, you be?" said Billy. "Bidding me get a horseback upon that bit of a rush? Maybe you want to persuade me that the rush I pulled for a while ago, there's a horse. Up, and no words," said the little man, looking very angry. "The best horse you ever rode was but a fool to it." So Billy, thinking all this was a joke, and fearing to vex his master, strutted across the rush. Barum, barum," cried the little man 3 times, which in English means to become great, and Billy did the same after him. Presently the rushes swelled up into fine horses, and away they went full speed, but Billy, who had put the rush between his legs, without much minding how he did it, found himself sitting on the horseback the wrong way, which was rather awkward, with his face to the horse's tail, and so quickly had his steed soared off with him, that he had no power to turn around, and there was nothing for to it but to hold on by the tail. At last they came to their journey's end, and stopped at the gate of a fine house. "Now, Billy," said the little man, "do as you see me do. Follow me close. But as you did not know your horse's head from his tail, mind that your own head does not spin round until you can't tell whether you are standing on it or on your heels. For remember that old liquor, though able to make a cat speak, can make a man dumb." The little man then said some queer kind of words, of which Billy could make no meaning, but he contrived to say them after him for all that. And they both went in through the keyhole of the door, through one keyhole and after another, until they got into the wine cellar, which was well stored with all kinds of wine. The little man fell to drinking as hard as he could, and Billy, no way disliking the example, did the same. "The best of masters are you surely," said Billy to him. "Or, no matter who is the next. Well, please, will I be in your service if you can give me plenty to drink?" "I have made no bargain with you," said the little man. "Make none, but up and follow me." They went, through keyhole after keyhole, and each mounting upon the rush which left at the hall door, scampered off, kicking the clouds before them like snowballs as soon as the words "Boram, Boram, Boram" had passed their lips. When they came back to the fort field, the little man dismissed Billy, bidding him there the next night at the same hour. Thus they did go on night after night, shaping their course one night here and another night there, sometimes north and sometimes east, and sometimes south, until there was not a gentleman's wine cellar in all Ireland they had not visited, and could tell the flavour of every wine in it, as well, aye, better than the butler himself. One night, when Billy McDaniel met the little man as usual in the fort field, and was going on the bog to fetch the horses for their journey, his master said to him, "Billy, I shall want another horse tonight, for maybe we may bring back more company than we take." So Billy, who now knew better than to question any word given to him by his master, brought a third rush, much wondering who it might be that would travel back in their company, and whether he was about to have a fellow servant. "If I have," thought Billy, "she'll go and fetch the horses from the bog every night, for I don't see why not every inch of me as good a gentleman as my master." Well, away they went, Billy leading the third horse, and never stopped until they came to a snug farmer's house in the country Limerick, close to the old castle of Carrigunniel. That was built, they say, by the great Brian Boru. Within the house there was great carousing going forward, and the little man stopped outside for some time to listen. Then, turning round all of a sudden, they said, "Billy, be 1,000 years old tomorrow." "God bless us, sir." "Billy, will you?" "Don't say those words again, Billy," said the old man, "or you'll be my ruin forever. Billy, it'll be 1,000 years in the world tomorrow. I think it is full time for me to get married." "I think so too, without any doubt to at all," said Billy. If you ever mean to marry, to that purpose," said the little man, "come all the way to Carrigunniel, where in this house, this very night, is young Darby Riley going to be married to Bridget Rooney. She is a tall and comely girl, and is come of decent people. I think of marrying her myself and taking her off with me." "And what will Darby Riley say to that?" said Billy. "Silence," said the little man, putting on his look. "Did not bring you here to ask I did not bring you here with me to ask questions." Without holding further argument, he began saying the queer words which had the power of passing through the keyhole as free as air, and which Billy thought himself mighty clever as able to say after him. And they both went, and for the better of the company, the little man perched himself up as nimbly as a cock sparrow upon one of the big beams which went across the house over all their heads, and Billy did the same upon another facing him. But not being much accustomed to roosting in such a place, his legs hung down as untidy as may be, and it was quite clear he had not taken pattern after the way in which the little man had bundled himself up together. If the little man had been a tailor all his life, he could not have sat more contentedly upon his haunches. There they were, both master and man, looking down upon the fun that was going forward. Near them were the pure Easton piper, and the father of Darby Riley, with Darby's two brothers and his uncle's sons, and there were both the father and the mother of Bridget Rooney, and proud enough the old couple were that night of their daughter, as good right they had, and her 4 sisters with brand new ribbons in their caps, and her 3 brothers all looking as clean and ever as any 3 boys in Munster, and there were aunts and uncles, and gossips and cousins enough besides to make a full house of it, and plenty was there to eat and drink on the table for every one of them, if they had been double the number. Now it happened just as Mrs. Rooney had helped with reference to the first cut to the pig's head which was placed before her, beautifully bolstered up with white savoys, that the bride gave a sneeze, which made every one at the table start, but not a soul said "God bless us," all thinking that the priest would have done so, as he ought if he had done his duty, for no one wished to take the word out of his mouth, which unfortunately was preoccupied with pigs' heads and greens. And after a moment's pause, the fun and merriment at the bridal feast went on without the pious benediction. Of this circumstance, both Billy and his master were no inattentive spectators from their exalted stations. "Ha!" exclaimed the little man, throwing one like from an arm with a joyous flourish, and his eye twinkled with a strange light, while his eyebrows became elevated into the curvature of Gothic arches. "Ha!" glaring down at the bride and then up at Billy. "I have half of her now, surely. Let her sneeze but twice more, and she is mine, in spite of priest, mass book, and R.B. Riley." Again the fair Bridget sneezed, but it was so gentle and she blushed so much that few except the little man took or seemed to take notice, and no one thought of saying, "God bless us." Billy all this time regarded the poor girl with the most rueful expression of countenance, for he could not help thinking what a terrible thing it was for a nice young girl of 19, with large blue eyes, transparent skin, and dimpled cheeks, suffused with health and joy, to be obliged to marry an ugly little bit of a man, who was 1,000 years old, barring a day. "Hey, well, come on in, Dingle. Thank you very much for coming by. Back and relax as we enjoy some folks' tales." At this critical moment, the bride gave a third sneeze, and Billy roared out with all his might, "God save us!" Whether this exclamation resulted from his soliloquy, or from the mere force of habit, he never could tell exactly himself, but no sooner was it uttered than the little man, his face glowed with rage and disappointment, sprang from the beam on which he had perched himself, and shrieking out in the shrill voice of a cracked bagpipe, "I discharge you from my service, Billy McDaniel. Take that for your wages," gave poor Billy a most furious kick in the back, which sent his unfortunate servant sprawling upon his face and hands right in the middle of the supper table. "You're very welcome, Dingle." If Billy was astonished, how much more so was every one of the company into which he was thrown with so little ceremony. But when they heard his story, Father Cooney laid down his knife and fork, and married the young couple out of hand with all speed, and Billy McDaniel danced the rink at their wedding, and plenty had a drink at it too, which was what he thought more of than dancing. This one's Farah Darrig and Donegal by Miss Letitia McClintock. Pat Diver, the tinker, was a man well accustomed to a wandering life, and to strange shelters. He had shared the beggar's blanket in smoky cabins. He had crouched beside the still in many a nook and corner where poteen was made, on the wild Inishowen mountains. He had even slept on the bare heather, or on the ditch, with no roof over him but the vault of heaven. Yet were all his nights of adventure tame and commonplace when compared with one special night. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Good luck on you're able to finish your report soon. During the day preceding that night, he had mended all the kettles and saucepans in Moville and Greencastle, and was on his way to Culdaff, where night overtook him on a lonely mountain road. He knocked at one door after another, asking for a night's lodging, while he jingled the halfpence in his pocket, but was everywhere refused. Where was the boasted hospitality of Inishowen, which he had never known before to fail? It was of no use to be able to pay when the people seemed so churlish. Thus thinking, he made his way towards a light a little further on, and knocked at another door. An old man and woman were seated, one at each side of the fire. "Will you please give me a night's lodging, sir?" asked Pat respectfully. "Can you tell me a story?" replied the old man. "Well, then I can't say I'm good at storytelling," replied the puzzled tinker. "And you must go no further, for none but them can tell a story will get in here." This reply was made in so decided a tone that Pat did not attempt to repeat his appeal, but turned away reluctantly to resume his weary journey. "A story indeed," muttered he. Old wives' tales to please the weans. As he took up his bundle of tinkering implements, he observed a barn standing rather behind the dwelling house, and aided by the rising moon he made his way towards it. It was a clean, roomy barn with a rolled-up heap of straw in one corner. Here was a shelter not to be despised, so Pat crept under the straw and was soon asleep. He could not have slept very long when he was awakened by the tramp of feet, and peeping cautiously through a crevice in his straw covering, he saw 4 immensely tall men enter the barn, dragging a body, which they threw roughly upon the floor. They next lighted a fire in the middle of the barn and fastened the corpse by the feet with a great rope to a beam in the roof. One of them then began to turn it slowly before the fire. "Come on," said he, addressing a gigantic fellow, the tallest of the 4. "I'm tired. You be to take your turn." "Fax and troth, I'll no turn him," replied the big man. "There's Pat Diver under the straw. Why wouldn't he take his turn?" With hideous clamour, the 4 men called the wretched Pat, who, seeing there was no escape, thought it was wisest plan to come forth as was bidden. "Now, Pat," said they, "you'll turn the corpse, but if you let him burn, you'll be tied up there and roasted in his place." Pat's hair stood on end, and the cold perspiration poured from his forehead, but there was nothing to do but to perform this dreadful task. Seeing him fairly embarked in it, the tall men went away. Soon, however, the flames rose so high as to singe the rope, and the corpse fell with a great thud upon the fire, scattering the ashes and embers, and extracting a howl of anguish from the miserable cook, who rushed to the door and ran for his life. He ran on until he was ready to drop with fatigue, when seeing a drain overgrown with tall rank grass, he thought he would creep in there and lie hidden until morning. But he was not many minutes in the drain before he heard the heavy trampling again, and the 4 men came up with their burden, which they laid down on the edge of the drain. "I'm tired," said one to the giant. "It's your turn to carry him a piece now." "Fae and troth, I'll no carry him," replied he. "But there's Pat Diver in the drain. Why wouldn't he come out and take his turn?" "Come out, Pat, come out!" roared all the men, and Pat, almost dead with fright, crept out. He staggered on under the weight of the corpse until he reached Kilton Abbey, a ruin festooned with ivy, where the brown owl hooted all night long, and the forgotten dead slept around the walls under dense, matted tangles of brambles and bentweed. No one ever buried there now, but Pat's tall companions turned into the wild graveyard and began digging a grave. Pat, seeing them thus engaged, thought he might once try to escape, and climbed up into a hawthorn tree in the fence, hoping to be hidden in the boughs. "I'm tired," said the man who was digging the grave. "Here, take the spade," addressing the big man. "It's your turn." "Fie and troth, it's no my turn," replied him as before. "There's Pat Diver in the tree. Why wouldn't he come down and take his turn?" Pat came down to take the spade, but just then the cocks in the little farmyards and cabins round the abbey began to crow, and the men looked at one another. "We must go," said they. "Well, it is for you, Pat Diver." The cocks crowed, for if they had not, you'd just been bundled into that grave with the corpse. 2 months passed, and Pat had wandered far and wide over the county Donegal, when he chanced to arrive at Raphoe during a fair. Among the crowd that filled the diamond, he came suddenly on the big man. "How are you, Pat Diver?" said he, bending down to look into the tinker's face. "You're the adventures of me, sir, for I haven't had the pleasure of knowing you," faltered Pat. "Do you not know me?" whispered. "When you go back to Eanshowen, you'll have a story to tell." The Pooka. The Pooka seems essentially an animal spirit. Some derive his name from Puck, a he-goat, and speculative persons consider him the forefather of Shakespeare's Puck. On solitary mountains and among old ruins he lives, grown monstrous with much solitude, and is of the race of the nightmare. And the manuscript story called Magna Michomhara, of uncertain authorship, writes me Mr. Douglas Hyde, we read that out of a certain hill in Leinster, there used to emerge as far as his middle a plump, sleek, terrible steed, and speak in human voice to each person about November Day, and he was accustomed to give intelligent and proper answers to such as consulted him, concerning all that would befall them until the November of next year, and when the people used to leave gifts and presents at the hill until the coming of Patrick and the holy clergy. This tradition appears to be a cognate one with that of the puka. Yes, unless it was merely an alg ishka, or water horse. For these, we are told, were common once, and used to come out of the water to gallop on the sands and in the fields, and people would often go between them in the marge and bridle them, and they would make the finest of horses if only you could keep them away from the sight of water. But if once they saw a glimpse of the water, they would plunge in with their rider, and tear him to pieces at the bottom. It being a November spirit, however, tells in favor of the puka, for November Day is sacred to the puka. It is hard to realize that wild, staring phantom, grown sleek and civil. He has many shapes, is now a horse, now an ass, now a bull, now a goat, now an eagle. Like all spirits, he is only half in the world of form. The Piper and the Puka, by Douglas Hyde. Translated literally from the Irish, of the Lebar Sigilicecta. Yeah, there's no way I can remotely pronounce it. In the old times, there was a half-fool living in Dunmore, in the county Galway, and although he was excessively fond of music, he was unable to learn more than one tune, and that was the Black Rogue. He used to get a good deal of money from the gentlemen, for they used to get sport out of him. One night the piper was coming home from a house where there had been a dance, and he half drunk, when he came to a little bridge that was up by his mother's house. He squeezed the pipes on and began playing the Black Rogue. The puka came behind him and flung him up on his back. There were long horns of the puka, and the pipe got a good grip of them, and then he said, "Destruction on you, you nasty beast, let me home. I have a 10-penny piece in my pocket for my mother, and she wants snuff." "Never mind your mother," said the puka, "but keep your hold. If you fall, you will break your neck and your pipes." Then the puka said to him, "Play up for me the Shan van Vocht." "I don't know it," said the piper. "Never mind whether you do or you don't," said the puka. "Play up, and I'll make you know." The piper put wind in his bag, and he played such music as he made himself wonder. "Upon my word, you're a fine music master," said the piper then. "Tell me where you're for bringing me." There's a great feast in the house of the Banshee on the top of Crow Patrick tonight," said the puka. "And I'm for bringing you there to play music, and take my word, you'll get the price of your trouble." "By my word, you'll save me a journey then," said the piper. "For Father William put a journey to Crow Patrick on me, because I stole the white gander from him last Martinmas." The puka rushed him across the hills and bogs and rough places till he brought him to the top of Crow Patrick. Then the puka struck 3 blows with his foot, and a great door opened, and they passed in together into a fine room. The piper saw a golden table in the middle of the room, and hundreds of old women sitting round about it. The old woman rose up and said, "100,000 welcomes to you, you puka of November." "Who is this you?" "The best piper in Ireland," says the puka. One of the old women struck a blow on the ground, and a door opened in the side of the wall, and what should the piper see coming but the white gander which he had stolen from Father William. "By my conscience then," said the piper, "myself and my mother ate every taste of that gander. Only one wing, and I gave that to Moirua, and she told the priest I stole his gander." The gander cleaned the table and carried it away, and the puka said, "Play up music for these ladies." The piper played up, and the old woman began dancing, and they were dancing till they were tired. Then the puka said to pay the piper, and every old woman drew out a gold piece and gave it to him. "By the tooth of Patrick," said he, "as rich as the son of a lord." "Come with me," says puka, "and I'll bring you home." They went out to then, and just as he was going to ride on puka, the gander came up to him, and gave him a new set of pipes. The puka was not long until he brought him to Dunmore, and he threw the piper off at the little bridge, and then he told him to go home, and says to him, You have two things now that you never had before. You have sense and music. The piper went home, and he knocked at his mother's door, saying, "Let me in. I'm as rich as a lord, and I'm the best piper in Ireland." "You're drunk," said the piper. Oh gosh, that's funny. "You're drunk, go home." "But I am home." "No indeed," says the piper. "I haven't drunk a drop." The mother let him in and gave her the gold pieces. "Wait now," says he, "till you hear the music I'll play." He buckled on the pipes, but instead of music, there came a sound as if all the geese and ganders in Ireland were screeching together. He wakened the neighbors, and they were all mocking him until he put on the old pipes, and then he played melodious music for them, and after that he told them all had gone through that night. The next morning, when his mother went to look at the gold pieces, there was nothing there but the leaves of a plant. The piper went to the priest and told him his story, but the priest would not believe a word from him until he put the pipes on for him, and then the screeching of the ganders and geese began. "Leave my sight, you thief," says the priest. But nothing would do the piper till he would put the old pipes on him, to show the priest that his story was true. He buckled on the old pipes, and he played melodious music, and from that day till the day of his death, there was never a piper in the country Galway was as good as he was. Daniel O'Rourke by T. Crofton Croker. People may have heard of the renowned adventures of Daniel O'Rourke, but how few are there who know of that the cause of all its perils above and below was neither more nor less than his having slept under the walls of the Pooka's Tower. I knew the man well. He lived at the bottom of Hungry Hill, just at the right hand side of the road as you go towards Bantry. An old man was he. At the time he told me the story, with grey hair and a grey nose, and it was on the 25th of June, 1813, that I heard it from his own lips, as he sat smoking his pipe under the old poplar tree, on as fine an evening as ever shone from the sky. Was going to visit the caves in Dursey Island, having spent the morning at Glengariff. "I've often asked to tell it, sir," said he, "so that this is not the first time. The master's son, you see, had come from beyond foreign parts in France and Spain, as young gentlemen used to go before Bonaparte or any such was heard of. Sure enough, there was a dinner given to all the people on the ground, gentle and simple, high and low, rich and poor. The old gentlemen were the gentlemen after all, save in your honour's presence. They'd swear at a body a little, to be sure, and maybe you've won a cut of the whip now and then, but we are no looser by it in the end. They were so easy and civil, and kept such rattling houses and thousands of welcomes, and there was no grinding for a rent, and there was hardly a tenant on the estate that did not taste of his landlord's bounty often and often in a year. But now it's another thing. No matter that, sir, for I'd better be telling you my story. Well, we had everything of the best, and plenty of it, and we ate and we drank and we danced, and the young master by the same token danced with Peggy Barry from Mulherin. A lovely young couple they were, though they are both low enough now. To make a long story short, I got as a body may say, the same thing as tipsy almost, for I can't remember ever at all. No ways how it was I left the place, only I did leave it, that's certain. Well, I thought for that all myself I just stepped to Molly Cronahan's, the fairy woman, to speak a word about the bracket heifer that was bewitched, and so I was crossing the stepping stones of the ford at Ballyshannon, and was looking up at the stars, and bless myself, why, it was Lady Day. I missed my foot, and so I fell into the water. Death alive, oh, I'll be drowned now. However, I began swimming away for dear life, till at last I got ashore, somehow or another, but never the one of me can tell how, upon a dissolute island. I wandered and wandered about there, without knowing where I wandered, until at last I got into a bright bog. The moon was shining as bright as fair are your fairy lady's eyes, sir, with your pardon for mentioning her. And I looked east and west and north and south and every way, and nothing did I see but bog, bog, bog. I could never find out how I got into it, and my heart grew cold with fear. For sure and certain I was there that it would be my barren place. So I sat down upon a stone which, as good luck would have it, was close by me, and I began to scratch my head and sing the Olagun, when all of a sudden the moon grew black, and I looked up and saw something for all the world as if it was moving down between me and it, and I could not tell what it was. Down it came with a pounce, and it looked at me full in the face. And what was it but an eagle, a finer one as ever flew from the kingdom of Kerry. So he looked at me in its face, and he says to me, "Daniel O'Rourke," says he, "how do you do?" "Very well, I thank you, sir," says I. "I hope you're well," wondering out my sense all the time how an eagle came to speak like a Christian. "What brings you here, Dan?" says he. "Nothing at all, sir," says I. "Only I wish I was safe home again." "Is it out of the island you want me to go, Dan?" says he. "'Tis, sir," say I. So I up and told him how I had taken a drop too much and fell into the water, how I swam to the island, and how I got into the bog and did not know my way out of it. "Dan," says he, after a minute's thought, "though it is very improper for you to get drunk on Lady Day, yet as you are a decent sober man who tends mass well and never flings stones at me or mine, nor cries out after us in the fields, my life for yours," says he. "So get up on my back and grip me well, for fear you'd fall off, and I'll fly you out of the bog." "I'm afraid," says I, "your honour's making game of me, for ever heard of riding a horseback on an eagle before." "'Pon the honour of a gentleman," says he, putting his right foot on his breast, "I'm quite in earnest, and so now either take my offer or starve in the bog. Besides, I see that your weight is sinking the stone." It was true enough, as he said, for I found the stone every minute going from under me. I had no choice. So thinks I to myself, faint heart never won fair lady, and this is fair persuadance. "I thank your honour," says I, "for the loan of your civility, and I'll take your kind offer." I therefore mounted upon the back of the eagle, and held him tight enough by the throat, and up he flew in the air like a lark. Little I knew the trick it was going to serve me. Up, up, up. God knows how far up he flew. Why then said I to him, thinking he did not know the right way home, very civilly, but because why, I was in power entirely, sir, say, "Please your honour's glory, and with humble submission to your better judgment, if you'd fly down a bit, you're now just over my cabin, and I could be put down there, and many thanks to your worship." Christopher. Ross then said, "You think me a fool? Down in the next field, and don't see 2 men and a gun. A word, it would be no joke to ship this way to oblige a drunken blackguard that I picked you off a stone in a bog. Bother you," said I to myself, but I could not for what was the use? Sir, up he kept flying, and asking him every minute, "Fly down, and we're all no use. Where in the world are you going, sir?" says I to him. "Hold your tongue, Jen," says he. "Mind your own business, and don't be interfering with the business of people." "Faith, this is my business, I think," says I. "Be quiet, Dan," says he. So I said no more. Christian is different from Catholic. Roman Catholic is a Christian denomination. Like, if they're using it, like, in the story or whatever, it would be like, I'd say Christian or whatever, although it's going to be assumed, like, Roman Catholic because of, that was the big, very dominant form in Ireland. Well, Roman Catholicism is like kind of like the dominant in, I guess what would be considered Southern Ireland. The northern, what would be like Northern Ireland now or whatever, is more of where the Protestant would be more the Protestant North. Which was some of the reason there had been like so long for issues between yeah, which be a big point and part of like the conflict between the Irish and the English. The English being Protestant, and then most of Ireland, with the exception of the north, being Catholic. At last, where should we come to, but to the moon itself? Now you can't see it from this, but there is, or there was in my time, a reaping hook sticking out to the side of the moon. This way, drawing the figure thus, on the ground with the end of his stick. Then said the eagle, I'm tired with this long a fly, I heard no notion 'twas so far. My lord, sir, so I, the word asked you to fly so far, was it? Said I. Not I beg and pray and beseech you to stop half an hour ago. There's no use talking, Dan, said he. I'm tired bad enough, so you must get off and sit down on the moon until I rest myself. Sit down on the moon? Is it upon that little round thing then? Why then, sure I'd fall off with a minute, and be kilt and spilt, and smashed all to bits. You're a vile deceiver, you are. Not at all, Dan, said he. You can catch fast hold of the reaping hook that's sticking out to the side of the moon, and 'twill keep you up. I won't then, said I. Be not, said he. Quiet. Quite quiet. If you don't, my men, I shall just give you a shake and one slap of my wing and send you down to the ground, where every bone in your body will be smashed as small as a drop of dew on a cabbage leaf in the morning. Why then, I'm in a fine way, said I to myself, ever to have come along with the likes of you. And so giving him a hearty curse in Irish, for feared he'd know what I said, I got off his back with a heavy heart, took hold of the reaping hook, and sat down upon the moon, and a mighty cold seat it was, I can tell you that. When he had me there fairly landed, he turned about on me and said, Good morning to you, Daniel O'Rourke, said he. I think I've nicked you fairly now. You robbed my nest last year. 'Twas true enough for him, but how he found it out is hard to say. In return, you are free welcome to cool your heels dangling upon the moon like a cock-throw. Is that all? And is this the way you leave me, you brute, says I. You ugly, unnatural beast. And is this the way you serve me at last? Bad luck to yourself with your hooked nose and to all your breed, you blackguard. 'Twas all to no matter of use. He spread out his great big wings, burst out laughing and flew away like lightning. I bawled after him to stop, but I might have called and bawled forever without his minding me. Away he went, and never saw him that day to this. Sorrow fly away with him. You may be sure I was in disconsolate condition, and kept roaring out for bare grief, when all at once the door opened right in the middle of the moon, creaking on its hinges that had been opened for a month before. I suppose they never thought of greasing 'em, and out there walks, who do you think but the man in the moon himself? I know him by his bush. Good morning to you, Daniel O'Rourke, says he. How do you do? Very well, thank your honour, says I. I hope your honour's well. What brought you here, Dan, said he. So I told him how I was a little overtaken in liquor at the master's, and how I was cast on a dissolute island, and how I lost my way in the bog, and how the thief of an eagle promised to fly me out of it, and how instead of that he had fled me up to the moon. Dan, said the man in the moon, taking a pinch of snuff when I was done. You must not stay here. Indeed, sir, says I. 'Tis much against my will I'm here at all, but how am I to go back? That's your business, said he. Dan, mine is to tell you that here you must not stay, so be off in less than no time. Doing no harm, says I, only holding on hard by the reaping hook, lest I fall off. That's what you must not do, Dan, says he. Pray, sir, says I, ask you how many you are in family, you would not give a poor traveller lodging. I'm sure it is not so often you've trouble with strangers coming to see yourself, for 'tis a long way. I'm by myself, Dan, says he, but you'd better let go the reaping hook. Faith, and with your leave, says I, I'll not let go to the group. The more you bids me, the more I won't go. So I will, you had better, Dan, says Why then, my little says I, taking the whole weight of him with my eyes from head to foot. There are 2 words to that bargain, and I'll not budge. But you may be like, if we'll see how that has to be, says he. And back he went, giving the door such a great bang after him, for it was plain he was huffed, that I thought the moon and all would fall down with it. Well, I was preparing myself to try strength with him. Then back again he comes with the kitchen cleaver in his hand, without saying a word. He gives 2 bangs to the handle of the reaping hook, and that was keeping me up. And whap, came in 2. Good morning to you, Dan, says the spiteful little old blackguard, when he saw me cleanly fallen down with a bit of the handle in my hand. I thank you for your visit, and fair weather after you, Daniel. I had not time to make answer to him, for I was tumbling over and rolling at the rate of a fox hunt. God help me, says I. But this is a pretty pickle for a decent man to be in at this time of night. I'm now sold fairly. The word was not out of my mouth when whiz, which did fly by close to my ear, but a flock of wild geese, all the way from my own bog about Ishino. Else how should they know me? The old gander who was their general turning me about his head cried at me, Is that you, Dan? The same, said I, not a bit daunted now that I said, for I was by this time used to all kinds of bedevilment, and besides, I knew him of old. Good morning to you, says he. Daniel O'Rourke, how are you in health this morning? Well, very well, sir, says I. I thank you kindly, drawing my breath, for I was mightily in want of some. Up your honour's the same. I think 'tis fallen you are, Daniel, says he. You may say that, sir, says I. And where are you going all the way so fast, said the gander. So I told him how I'd taken the drop, how I came on the island, and how I lost my way to the bog, and how the thief in the eel flew me up to the moon, and how the man in the moon turned me out. Dan, said he, well, I'll save you. Put out your hand and catch me by the leg, and I'll fly you home. Sweet is your hand in a pitcher of honey, my jewel, says I. All the time I thought in myself that I don't much trust you, but there was no help, so I caught the gander by the leg, and away I and the other geese flew after him as fast as hops. We flew and we flew and we flew, till we came right over the wide ocean. I knew it well, for I saw Cape Clear to my right hand, sucking out of the water. Lord, said I to the goose, I thought it was best to keep a civil tongue in my head away. Fly to land, if you please. It's impossible, you see, Dan, you says, for a while, because you see we're going to Arabia. To Arabia, said I. Surely some place in foreign parts far away. Mr. Goose, why then, to be sure, I'm a man to be pitied on you. Swiss, you fool, city, hold your tongue. I tell you Arabia is a very decent sort of place. As like West Carbury as one egg and is like another, only there is a little more sand there. Just as we were talking, a ship hove in sight, scudding so beautiful before the wind, and... Ah, then, sir, said I, you drop me off at the ship, if you please. Not far over it, said he. If I dropped you now, you would go splash into the sea. I would not, said I. I know better than that, for it is just clean under us. So let me drop now at once. If you must, said he. There, take your own way. And he opened his claw, and faith, he was right. Sure enough, I came down plump into the very bottom of the salt sea. Down to the very bottom I went, and I gave myself up then forever, when a whale walked up to me, scratching himself after his night's sleep, and looked me full in the face, and never a word did he say, but lifting me up his tail, he splashed me all over again with the cold salt water, till there wasn't a dry stitch upon my whole carcass. And I heard somebody saying, 'twas a voice I knew, Get up, you drunken brute, off of that. With that I woke up. And with that I woke up, and there was Judy with a tub full of water, which she was splashing all over me, for rest her soul, though she was a good wife, she never could bear to see me and drink, and had a bitter hand of her own. Get up, she said. Again, and all places in the parish would no place save you turn to lie down but under the old walls of Kapuka. An easy resting I'm sure you had of it. And sure enough I had, for I was fairly bothered out of my senses with eagles and men of the moons and flying ganders and whales, driving me through bogs and up the moon and down to the bottom of the green sea. If I was in drink 10 times over, long would it be before I'd lie down in the same spot again, I know that. Alright. Called the Kildare Puka by Patrick Kennedy. Sir H.R., when he was alive, used to live a good deal in Dublin, and he was once a great while out of the country on account of the 98 business. But the servants kept on in the big house at Rath, all the same as if the family were at home. Well, they used to be frightened out of their lives after going to their beds, with the banging of the kitchen door, and the clattering of fire irons, and the pots and plates and dishes. One evening, they sat up ever so long, keeping one another in heart, telling stories about ghosts and fetches. And that when, what would you have of it? The little scullery boy that used to be sleeping over the horses, and could not get room at the fire, crept in the hot hearth, and when he got tired of listening to the stories, swore a fear but he fell dead asleep. Well and good, after they were all gone and the kitchen fire ricked up, he was woke with the noise of the kitchen door opening, and the trampling of an ass on the kitchen floor. He peeped out, and what should he see but a big ass, sure enough, sitting on his bingo and yawning before the fire. After a little he looked about him, and began scratching his ears as if he was quite tired, and says he, I may as well begin fire at last. The poor boy's teeth began to chatter in his head, for says he, now he's going to eat me. But the fellow with the long ears and tail on him had something else to do. He stirred the fire, and then he brought in the pail of water from the pump, and filled the big pot that he put on the fire before he went out. He then put in his foot into the hot earth, and pulled out the little boy. He let a roar out of him with fright, but the puka only looked at him, and thrust out his lower lip to show how little he valued him, and then he pitched him into his pew again. Well, he then lay down the fire till he heard the boil coming on the water, and maybe there wasn't a plate or a dish or a spoon on the dresser that didn't fetch him and put into the pot, and wash and dry the whole bilin of them, as well as e'er a kitchen maid from that to Dublin town. He then put all of them up on their places on the shelves, and if he didn't give a good sweeping to the kitchen, leave it till again, then he comes and it's format the boy, let down one of his ears and cocked up the other and gave a grin. The poor fellow strove to roar around, but not a good came out of his throat. The last thing the puka done was to rake up the fire and walk out, giving such a slap at the door that the boy thought the house couldn't help tumbling down. Well, to be sure, if there wasn't a hullabaloo next morning when the poor fellow told his story. They could talk of nothing else the whole day. One said another said another. But a fat, lazy scullery girl said the wittiest thing of all. Musa, shissy, if the puka does be cleaning up everything that way when we are asleep, why should we be slaving ourselves for doing his work? Sure good Dean, says another. Them's the wisest word you ever said, quoth. Myself won't contradict you. So said, so done. Not a bit of a plate or dish saw a drop of water that evening, and not a besom was laid on the floor, and everyone went to bed soon after sundown. Next morning everything was as fine in the kitchen, and the Lord Mayor might eat his dinner off the flags. It was as great easy to the lazy servants, you may depend, and everything went on well till a foolhardy gag of a boy said he would stay up one night and have a chat with the puka. He was a little daunted when the door was thrown open and the ass marched up to the fire. And then, sir, says he at last, picking up courage, if it isn't taking a liberty, might I ask who you are, and why you are so kind as to do half of the day's work for the girls every night? No liberty at all, says the puka, says he. I'll tell you and welcome. I was a servant in the time of Squire R.'s father, and was the laziest rogue that ever was clothed and fed, and done nothing for it. When my time came for the other world, this is the punishment was laid on me, to come here and do all this labor every night, and then go out in the cold. Isn't so bad in the fine weather, but if you only knew what it was to stand with your head between your legs, facing the storm, from midnight to sunrise, on a bleak winter night. And could we think for your comfort, my poor fellow, says the boy. Musha, I don't know, says the puka, but I think a good quilted frieze coat would help would help to keep the life in me them long nights. Then in truth we'd be the ungrateful of people if we didn't feel for you. To make a long story short, the next night, but two of the boys were there again, and if he didn't delight the poor Pooka, holding up a fine warm coat before him, it's no matter. Between the Pooka and the man, his legs was got into the forearms of it, and it was buttoned down the breast and belly, and he was so pleased that he walked up to the glass to see how he looked. Says he, it's a long lane that has no turning. I'm much obliged to you and your servants. You have made me happy at last. Good night to you. So he was walking out, but the other cried, You're going too soon. What about the washing and sweeping? Ah, you may tell the girls that they must now get their turn. My punishment was to last till I was thought worthy of a reward for the way I had done my duty. You'll see me no more. And no more they did, and right sorry they were for having been in such a hurry to reward the ungrateful Pooka. The solitary fairies, the Banshee. The Banshee, from Ban, a woman, and she, a fairy, is an attendant fairy that follows the old families, and none but them, and wails before death. Many have seen her as she goes wailing and clapping her hands. The funeral cry of the peasantry is said to be an imitation of her cry. When more than one banshee is present, and they wail and sing in chorus, it is for the death of some holy or great one. An omen that sometimes accompanies the banshee is the Kobold, an immense black coach, mounted by a coffin, and drawn by the headless horse, is driven by a dullahan. It will go rumbling to your door, and if you opened it, according to Croker, a basin of blood will be thrown into your face. These headless phantoms are found elsewhere than in Ireland. In 1807, 2 of the sentries stationed outside St. James Park died of fright. A headless woman, the upper part of her body naked, used to pass at midnight and scale the railings. After a time, the sentries were stationed no longer at the haunted spot. In Norway, the heads of corpses were cut off to make their ghosts feeble. Thus came into existence the dullahan, perhaps. Unless, indeed, they are descended from that Irish giant who swam across the channel with his head in his teeth. How Thomas Connolly Met the Banshee, by J. Todhunter. Ah, the Banshee, sir. Well, sir, as I was striving to tell ye, I was going home from work one day, from Mr. Cassidy's that I told ye of. In the dusk of the evening, I had more than a mile, it was near 2 miles to Tracto, where I was lodging with a decent witty woman I knew, Biddy Maguire by name, so as to be near me work. It was the first week in November, and a lonesome road I had to travel, and dark enough, with trees above it, and about halfways there was a bit of brudge I had to cross, over one of them, little streams that runs into the Doctor. I walked on in the middle of the road, for there was no towpath at the time, Mr. Harry, nor for many a long day after that. But as I was saying, I walked along till I come nigh upon the bridge, where the road was a bit open there, right enough. I seen the hog's back of the old-fashioned bridge that used to be there till it was pulled down, and a white mist streaming out the water all around it. Well now, Mr. Harry, often as I'd passed by the place before, that night it seemed strange to me, and like a place you might see in a dream. And as I could have come up to it, I began to feel a cold wind blowing through the hollow of me heart. Mr. Thomas, says I to myself, is it yourself that's in it? Says I, or if it is, what's the matter with ye at all? At all, says I, so I put on a bold face on it, and I made a struggle to set one leg afore the other, until I came to the rise of the bridge, and there, God be us, in a cant all I see an old woman, as I thought, sitting on her hunkers, all crouched down, on her head bowed down, seemingly in greatest affliction. So I pitied the old crater, and thought it was worth a threaning for the mortal fright I was in. I up and seized to her. There's a cowled lodging for you, ma'am. Well, the sorrow after she says to that, took no more notice of me than if I hadn't let a word out of me, but kept rocking herself to and fro as if her heart was breaking. So I says to her again, ma'am, is there something the matter with ye? and I made for her to touch her on the shoulder. Only something stopped me, for as I looked closer I saw she was no more an old woman, nor was she an old cat. The first thing I took notice to, Mr. Harry, was her hair, that was streeling down over her shoulders, and a good yard on the ground on each side of her. Albeit the hucky farmer, but that was the hair. The likes of it I never seen on a mortal woman, young or old, before nor since. It grew as strong out for as out of a young slip of a girl you could see, but the colour of it was mystery to describe. The first squint I got of it I thought it was silvery grey like an old crone's. When I got up beside her, I saw but the glance o' the sky. It was sorta an scarlet colour, and the shine out o' like floss silk. It ran over her shoulders, and the two shapely arms was laying her head on for all the world like Mary Magdalene's in a picture. And then I perceived that the grey cloak and the green gown underneath it was made of no earthly material I ever laid eyes on. Now I needn't tell ye, sir, that I seen all this in the twinkle of a bedpost, long as I to make the narration of it. So I made a step back from her, and, the Lord between us arms, says I out loud, would I bless myself, Mr. Harry, the word wasn't out of my mouth before she turned her face on me. Mr. Harry, but that was the awfullest apparition I ever seen. The face of her as she looked up at me. God forgive me for saying it. It's more like the face of the Axiomo beyond in Marlborough Street Chapel, nor like any face I could mention, as pale as a corpse, and almost has freckles on it, like the freckles of a turkey egg, and the two eyes sewn in white red thread, from the terrible power of crying they had to do. As such a pair of eyes as were Mr. Harry, as blue as two forget-me-nots, and as cold as the moon in the bog hole of a frosty night, and a dead and live look in them that sent a cold shiver through the marrow of me bones. May the mortal, you could have wrung a cupful of cold perspiration out of the hair on me head that minute, so you could. Well, I thought the life it'd leave me entirely when she riz up from her hunkers. Lad, she looked mostly as tall as Nelson's pillar, and with the two eyes gazed back at me, and two arms stretched out before her, and a keen out of her that riz the hair of me scalp, till it was as stiff as the hog's bristles in a new hearth broom. Away she glides round the angle of the bridge and down with her into the stream that ran underneath it. 'Twas then I began to suspect what she was. Thomas, says I to myself, says I, and I made a great struggle to get me two legs into a trough, in spite of the even fright that pair of them were in, and how I brought myself home that same night the Lord in heaven only knows, for I never could tell, but I must have had tumbled agin the door and shot in the head foremost in the middle of the floor, where I lay in a dead swoon for nearly an hour, and the first I knew was Mrs. Maguire standing over me with a jorum of punch she was pouring down me throat, to bring back the life to me. In my head, in a pool of cold water, she dashed over me in her first fright. "Ah, Mr. Connolly, she, what ails ye? She, to put the scare on a lone woman like that." Says she, and am I in this world or the next, says I. "Sha, where else would you be only here in my kitchen?" Says she. "Glory be to God," says I, "but I thought I was in purgatory at the last, not to mention an uglier place," says I. "Only it's too cold I find myself, and not too hot," says I. "Fie, and maybe you were no more halfways there, only for me," says she. "But what's come to it all? Is it your fetch you seen, Mr. Connolly?" "Ah," says I, "never mind what I seen," says I. So degrees I began to come to a little, and that's the way I met the banshee, Mr. Harry." "But how did you know it really was a banshee after all, Thomas?" "Begor, sir, I knew the apparition of her well enough, but it was confirmed by a circumstance that occurred at the same time. There was a Mr. O'Neill's that was come on a visit, you must know, to a place in the old neighbourhood, one to the old Nails in country Tyrone, a real old Irish family, and the banshee was heard keening around this house that same night. Be more than one that was in it, and sure enough, Mr. Harry, he was found dead in his bed the next morning. So if it wasn't the banshee I'd seen that time, I'd like to know what else it could have been." I really hope I don't have to read my stories with that guy, just because it's... oh gosh, it's demanding. A lamentation for the death of Sir Maurice Fitzgerald, Knight of Kerry, who was killed in Flanders, 1642. From the Irish by Clarence Mangan. There was lifted up one voice of woe, one lament of more than mortal grief. Through the wide south to and fro for a fallen chief in the dead of night, that cry thrilled through me. I looked out upon the midnight air. My own soul was all as gloomy as I knelt in prayer. O'er Loch Gur that night once twice, yea thrice, passed a wail of anguish for the brave, that half curled into ice, its moon mirroring wave. Then uprose a many-toned wild hymn in choral swell from Aughra's dark ravine. And Mowgli's phantom women mourned the Geraldine. Far on Caramana's emerald plains, shrieks and sighs were blended many hours, and Fermoy in fitful streams answered from her towers. Dougal, Kenalmiki, Amokili mourned in concert in their piercing keen. Woke to wondering life the stilly glens of Innichqueen. From Loughmoe to yellow Dunanor, there was fear the traders of Tralee gathered up their golden store and prepared to flee. For in ship and hall from night till morning showed the first faint beamings of the sun. All the foreigners heard the warning of the dreaded one. "'Tis," they spake, "portendeth death to us, if we fly not swiftly from our fate." Self-conceited idiots, thus ravingly to prate. Not for base-born higgling Saxon treasures ring laments like those by shore and sea. Not for churls with souls like hucksters waileth our banshee. For high Blasian race alone ever flows the music of her woe. For slain heir to bygone throne and for chief laid low. Hark, again methinks I hear her weeping yonder. Is she near me now as then? Or was but the night wind sweeping down the hollow glen? The Banshee of the McCarthys by T. Crofton Croker. Charles McCarthy was in the year of 1749, the only surviving son of a very numerous family. His father died when he was little more than 20, leaving him the McCarthy estate, not much encumbered, considering that it was an Irish one. Charles was gay, handsome, unfettered either by poverty, a father, or guardians, and therefore was not, at the age of 21, a pattern of regularity and virtue. In plain terms, he was an exceedingly dissipated, I fear I may say debauched young man. His companions were, as may be supposed, of the higher classes of the youth of his neighbourhood, and in general, of those whose fortunes were larger than his own, whose dispositions to pleasure were therefore under still less restrictions, and whose example he found at once an incentive and an apology for his irregularities. Besides Ireland, a place of this day not very remarkable for the coolness and steadiness of its youth, was then one of the cheapest countries in the world in most of those articles which money supplies for the indulgence of the passions. The odious exciseman, with his portentous book in one hand, his unrelenting pen held in the other, or stuck beneath his hat band and the ink bottle, black emblem of the informer, dangling from his waistcoat button, went, not then from alehouse to alehouse, denouncing all those patriotic dealers in spirits who preferred selling whiskey, which had nothing to do with English laws but to elude them, to retailing that poisonous liquor, which derived its name from the British Parliament that compelled its circulation among a reluctant people. Or if the gauger, recording angel of the law, wrote down the peccadillo of a publican, he dropped a tear upon the word and blotted it out forever. For welcome into the tables of their hospital neighbours, the guardians of excise, for they existed at all scrupled to abridge those luxuries which they freely shared, and thus the competition in the market between the smuggler, who incurred little hazard, and the personage accepted fair trader, who enjoyed little protection, made Ireland a land flowing not merely with milk and honey, but with whiskey and wine. in the enjoyment supplied by these, and in the many kindred pleasures to which frail youth is but too prone. Charles McCarthy indulged to such a degree that just about the time when he had completed his 24th year, after a week of great excess, he was seized with a violent fever, which from its malignity and the weakness of his frame left scarcely a hope of his recovery. His mother, who had at first made efforts to check his vices, and at last had been obliged to look on his rapid progress to ruin in silent despair, watched day and night at his pillow. The anguish of parental feeling was blended with that still deeper misery which those only know who had striven so hard to ruin virtue and piety a beloved and favorite child, yet have found him grow all that their hearts could desire, until he reached manhood, and then when their pride was highest and their hopes almost succeeded in fulfillment of their fondest expectations, has seen this idol of their affections plunge headlong into a course of reckless profligacy, and after a rapid career of vice, hang upon the verge of eternity, without the leisure or the power of repentance. Fervently she prayed that, if his life could not be spared, at least the delirium, which continued with increasing violence from the first few hours of its disorder, might vanish before death, and leave enough of light and calm for making his peace with offended heaven. After several days, however, nature seemed quite exhausted, and he sunk into a state too like death to be mistaken for the repose of sleep. His face had that pale, glossy marble look, which is in general so sure a symptom that life has left its tenement of clay. His eyes were closed and sunk, the lids having that compressed and stiffened appearance, which seemed to indicate that some friendly hand had done its last office. The lips, half closed and perfectly ashy, discovered just so much of the teeth as to give the features of death their most ghastly, but most impressive look. He laid upon his back with his hands stretched beside him, quite motionless, and his distracted mother, after repeated trials, could discover not the least symptom of animation. The medical man who attended, having tried the usual modes for ascertaining the presence of life, declared at last his opinion that it was flown, and prepared to depart from the house of mourning. His horse was seen to come to the door. A crowd of people who were collected before the windows or scattered in groups on in the lawn in front, gathered around where the door was opened. There were tenants, foresters, and poor relations of the family, with others attracted by affection or by that interest which partakes of curiosity, but is something more, and which collects the lower ranks round a house where a human being is its passage to another world. They saw the professional man come out from the hall door and approach his horse, and while slowly and with a melancholy air he prepared to mount, they clustered round him with inquiring and wistful looks. Not a word was spoken, but their meaning could not be misunderstood. The physician, when he got to his saddle, and while the servant was still holding the bridle as if to delay him, and was looking anxiously at his face, as if suspecting that he should leave the general suspense, shook his head, said in a low voice, "It's all over, James," and moved slowly away. Hello, Monkey News, welcome on in. We're currently doing a reading of a book of Irish myths and folktales. So feel free to sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the stream. The moment he had spoken, the women present, were very numerous, uttered a shrill cry, which having been sustained for about half a minute, fell suddenly into a full, loud, continued, and discordant, but plaintive wailing, above which occasionally were heard the deep sounds of a man's voice, sometimes in deep sobs, sometimes in more distinct exclamations of sorrow. This was Charles' foster brother, who moved about the crowd, now clapping his hands, now rubbing them together in an agony of grief. The poor fellow had been Charles' playmate and companion when a boy, and afterwards his servant, had always been distinguished by his peculiar regard and loved his young master as much, at least as he did his own life. When Mrs. McCarthy became convinced that the blow was indeed struck, and that her beloved son was sent to his last account, even in the blossoms of sin, she remained for some time gazing with fixedness upon his cold features. Then, as if something had suddenly touched the string of her tenderest affections, tear after tear trickled down her cheek, plain with anxiety and watching. Still she continued looking at her son, apparently unconscious that she was weeping, without once lifting her handkerchief to her eyes, until reminded of the sad duties which the custom of the country imposed upon her, by the crowd of females belonging to the better class of the peasantry, who now, crying audibly, nearly filled the apartment. She then withdrew to give directions for the ceremony of waking, for supplying the numerous visitors of all ranks with the refreshments usual on these melancholy occasions, though her voice was scarcely heard, and though no one saw her but the servants and one or two old followers of the family who assisted her in the necessary arrangements. Everything was conducted with the greatest regularity, and though she made no effort to check her sorrows, they never once suspended her attention, now more than ever required to preserve order in her household, which in this season of calamity, but for her, would have been all confusion. That night was perfectly far advanced. The boisterous lamentations which had prevailed during part of the day in and about the house, which had given place to a solemn and mournful stillness, and Miss McCarthy, whose heart, notwithstanding her long fatigue and watching, was yet too sore for sleep, was kneeling in fervent prayer in a chamber adjoining that of her son. Suddenly her devotions were disturbed by an unusual noise, proceeding from the persons who were watching round the body. First there was a low murmur, then all was silent, as if the movements of those in the chamber was checked by a sudden panic, and then a loud cry of terror burst from all within. The door of the chamber was thrown open, and all who were not overturned in the press rushed wildly into the passage which led to the stairs, into which Mrs. McCarthy's room opened. Mrs. McCarthy made her way through the crowd into her son's chamber, where she found him sitting up in the bed, and looking vacantly around like one risen from the grave. The glare thrown upon his sunk features and thin, lathy frame gave an unearthly horror to his whole aspect. Mrs. McCarthy was a woman of some firmness, but she was a woman, and not quite free from the superstitions of her country. She dropped on her knees and, clasping her hands, began to pray aloud. The form before her moved only its lips and barely uttered, "Mother." But though the pale lips moved, as if there was a design to finish the sentence, the tongue refused its office. Mrs. McCarthy sprung forward, and catching the arm of her son, exclaimed, "Speak! In the name of God and his saints, speak! Are you alive?" He turned to her slowly, and said, speaking still with apparent difficulty, "Is my mother alive? But sit down and collect yourself. I have that to tell which will astonish you still more than what you have seen." He leaned back upon his pillow, and while his mother remained kneeling by the bedside, holding one of his hands clasped in hers, and gazed on him with the look of one who distrusted all her senses, he proceeded, "Do not interrupt me until I have done. I wish to speak while the excitement of returning to life is upon me, as I know I shall soon need much repose. Of the commencement of my illness I have only a confused recollection, but within the last 12 hours I have been before the judgment seat of God. Do not stare incredulously at me. This is true as have been my crimes, and as I trust shall be repentance. I saw the awful judge arrayed in all the terrors which invest him when mercy gives place to justice. The dreadful pomp of offended omnipotence I saw, I remember. It is fixed here, printed on my brain in the characters indelible, but it passeth human language. What I can describe I may speak it briefly. It is enough to say, as I was weighed in the balance and found wanting, the irrevocable sentence was upon the point of being pronounced. The eye of my almighty judge, which had already glanced upon me, half spoke my doom. When I observed the guardian saint, to whom you so often directed my prayers when I was a child, looking at me with an expression of benevolence and compassion, I stretched forth my hands to him, and besought his intercession. I implore that 1 year, 1 month, might be given to me on earth to do penance and atonement for my transgressions. He threw himself at the feet of judge and supplicant for mercy. Never, not if ever, shall I pass through 10,000 successive states of being. Never for eternity shall I forget the horrors of that moment, when my fate hung decided. When an instant was to decide whether torments unutterable were to be my portion for endless ages. But the justice suspended its decree, and mercy spoke in accents of firmness but mildness. Return to that world in which thou hast lived but to outrage the laws of him who made that world and thee. 3 years are given thee for repentance. When those are ended, thou shalt again stand here to be saved or lost forever. I heard no more, I saw no more until I woke to life, the moment before you entered." Charles' strength continued just long enough to finish his last words, and on uttering them he closed his eyes, and lay quite exhausted. His mother, though, as was before, somewhat disposed to give credit to supernatural visitations, yet hesitated whether or not she should believe that, although wakened from a swoon, which might have been the crisis of his disease, He was still under the influence of delirium. Repose, however, was at all events necessary, and she took immediate measures that he should enjoy it undisturbed. After some hours of sleep, he woke refreshed, and thenceforth gradually but steadily recovered. Still he persisted in his account of the vision as he had first related it, and his persuasion of its reality had an obvious and decided influence on his habit and conduct. He did not altogether abandon the society of his former associates, for his temper was not soured by his reformation, but he never joined in their excesses, and often endeavored to reclaim them. How his pious exhortations succeeded I have never learnt, but of himself it is recorded that he was religious without ostentation, and temperate without austerity, giving a practical proof that vice may be exchanged for virtue, without the loss of respectability, popularity, or happiness. Time rolled on, and long before the 3 years were ended, the story of his visions was forgotten, or when spoken of, was usually mentioned as an assurance, as an incident proving the folly of believing in such things. Charles' health, from the temperance and regularity of his habits, became more robust than ever. His friends, indeed, had often occasion to rally him up on a serious and abstractness of demeanour, which grew upon him as he approached the completion of his 27th year, but for the most part his manner exhibited the same animation and cheerfulness for which he had always been remarkable. In company he evaded every endeavour to draw from him a distinct opinion on the subject of the supposed prediction, but among his own family it was well known that he still firmly believed it. However, when the day had nearly arrived on which the prophecy was, if at all, to be fulfilled, his whole appearance gave such promise of a long and healthy life that he was persuaded by his friends to ask a large party to an entertainment at Spring House to celebrate his birthday. But the occasion of this party, and the circumstance was attended, we best learned from a perusal of the following letters, which have been carefully preserved by some relations of his family. The first is from Miss McCarthy to a lady, a very near connection and valued friend of hers who lived in the county of Cork, at about 50 miles distance from Spring House. To Mrs. Barry Castleberry, Spring House, Tuesday morning, October 15th, 1752. My dearest Mary, I'm afraid I'm going to put your affection for your old friend and kinswoman to a severe trial. A 2 days' journey at this season over bad roads and through a troubled country will indeed require friendship for such as yours to persuade a sober woman to encounter. But the truth is, I have, or fancy I have, more than usual cause for wishing you near me. You know my son's story. I can't tell you how it is, but as next Sunday approaches, when the prediction of his dream or vision will prove false or true, I feel a sickening of the heart, which I cannot suppress, but which your presence, my dear Mary, will soften, as it has done so many of my sorrows. My nephew, James Ryan, is to be married to Jane Osborne, who you know as my son's ward, and the bridal entertainment will take place here on Sunday next, though Charles pleaded hard to have it postponed for a day or two longer. Would to God, but no more of this till we meet. Do prevail upon yourself to leave your good man for 1 week, if his farming concerns will not admit of his accompanying you, and come to us with the girls as soon as before Sunday as you can. Ever, my dear, Mary's attached cousin and friend, Anne McCarthy. Although this letter reached Castle very early on Wednesday, the messenger having travelled on foot for bog and moor by paths impassable to horse or carriage, Mrs. Battery, who at once determined on going, had so many arrangements to make for the regulation of her domestic affairs, which in Ireland, among the middle orders of the gentry, fall soon into confusion when the mistress of the family is away, that she and her 2 daughters were unable to leave until late on the morning of Friday. The eldest daughter remained to keep her father company and superintend the concerns of the household. As the travellers were to journey on an open one-horse vehicle, called the jaunting car, still used in Ireland, and as the roads, bad at all times, were rendered still worse by the heavy rains, it was their design to make 2 easy stages, to stop about midway the first night, and reach Spring House early on Saturday evening. This arrangement was now altered, as they found that from lateness of their departure they could proceed at utmost no farther than 20 miles on the first day, and they therefore proposed sleeping at the house of a Mr. Burke, a friend of theirs who lived at less than the distance from Castleberry. They reached Burke in safety after a rather disagreeable ride. What befell them on their journey the next day to Spring House, and after their arrival there, is fully recounted in a letter from the second Miss Barry to her eldest sister. Spring House, Sunday evening, the 20th of October, 1752. Dear Ellen, As my mother's letter which encloses you will announce to you briefly the sad intelligence, which I shall here relate more fully, I think it better to go regularly through the recital of the extraordinary events of the last 2 days. The Burkes kept us up so late on Friday night that yesterday was pretty far advanced before we could begin on journey, and the day closed when we were nearly 15 miles distant from this place. The roads were excessively deep from the heavy rains of the last week, and we proceeded so slowly that at last my mother resolved on passing the night at the house of Mr. Burke's brother, who lives about a quarter of a mile off the road. Coming here to breakfast in the morning, the day had been windy and showery, and the sky looked fitful, gloomy, and uncertain. The moon was full, and at times shone clear and bright. At others it was wholly concealed behind the thick, black, and rugged masses of clouds that rolled rapidly along, and were every moment becoming larger and collecting together, as if gathering strength for a coming storm. The wind which blew in our faces whistled bleakly along the low hedges of the narrow road, on which proceeded with difficulty from the number of deep sloughs, and which afforded not the least shelter, no plantation being within some miles of us. My mother therefore asked Leary, who drove the jaunting car, how far we were from Mr. Burke's. "'Tis about 10 spades from this to the cross. We have then only to turn to the left into the avenue, ma'am." "Very well, Leary. Turn up to Mr. Burke's as soon as you reach the crossroads." My mother had scarcely spoken these words when a shriek that made us thrill, as if our very hearts were pierced by, burst from the hedge to the right of our way. If it resembled anything earthly, it seemed the cry of a female, struck by a sudden and mortal blow, giving out her life in one long deep pang of expiring agony. "Heaven defend us!" exclaimed my mother. "Go you over the hedge, Larry, and save that woman, ere she is not yet dead, while we run back to the hut. We have just passed and alarmed the village near it." "Woman," said Leary, beating the horse violently, while his voice trembled. "That's no woman. The sooner we get on, ma'am, the better." And he continued his efforts to quicken the horse's pace. We saw nothing. The moon was hid. It was quite dark, and we had for some time expecting a heavy fall of rain. But just as Leary had spoken, and had succeeded in making the horse trot briskly forward, we distinctly heard a loud clapping of hands, followed by a succession of screams that seemed to denote the last excesses of despair and anguish, and to issue from a person running forward inside the hedge to keep pace with our progress. Still we saw nothing, until when we were about 10 yards of the place, where an avenue branched off to Mr. Burke's to the left, and the road turned to Spring House on the right. The moon started suddenly from behind a cloud, and enabled us to see as plainly as I now see this paper, the figure of a tall, thin woman, with uncovered head and long hair that floated around her shoulders, attired in something which seemed either a loose white cloak or a sheet thrown hastily about her. She stood on the corner hedge, where the road on which we were met, that which leads to Spring House, with her face toward us, her left hand pointing to this place, and her right arm waving rapidly and violently as if to draw us on in that direction. The horse had stopped, apparently frightened at the sudden presence of the figure which stood in the manner I've described, still uttering the same piercing cries for about half a minute. It then leaped up upon the road, disappearing from view for one instant. The next was seen standing upon a high wall a little away the avenue on which we were purposed to go, still pointing towards the road to Spring House, but in an attitude of defiance and command as it prepared to oppose our passage up the avenue. The figure was now quite silent, and its garments, which had before flown loosely in the wind, were closely wrapped up around it. "Go on, Leary, to Spring's House in God's name," said my mother. "Whatever world it belongs to, it will provoke it no longer." "'Tis the Banshee, ma'am," said Leary, "and I would not, for what my life is worth, go anywhere this blessed night but to Spring House. I'm afraid there's something bad going forward, or she would not send us there." So saying, he drove forward, and as we turned on the road to the right, the moon suddenly withdrew its light. We saw the apparition no more, but we heard plainly a prolonged clapping of hands, gradually dying away as if it issued from a person rapidly retreating. We proceeded as quickly as the badness of the roads and the fatigue of the poor animal that drew us would allow, and arrived here about 11 o'clock last night. The scene which awaited us, you have learned from my mother's letter. To explain it fully, I must recount to you some of the transactions which took place here during the last week. You are aware that Jane Osborne was to have married this day to James Ryan, and that they and her friends here for the last week. On Tuesday last, the very day on the morning of which Cousin McCarthy dispatched a letter inviting us, the whole of the company were walking about the grounds a little before dinner. It seemed that unfortunate creature, who had been seduced by James Ryan, was seen prowling in the neighborhood in a moody, melancholy state for some days previous. He had separated from her for several months, and they say, had provided for her rather handsomely, but she had been seduced by the promise of his marrying her, and the shame of her unhappy condition, uniting with disappointment and jealousy, had disordered her intellects. During the whole forenoon of this Tuesday, she had been walking in the plantations near Spring House, with her cloak folded tight around her, the hood nearly covering her face, and she had avoided conversing with or even meeting any of the family. Charles McCarthy, at the time I mentioned, was walking between James Ryan and another, at a little distance from the rest on a gravel path skirting a shrubbery. The whole party was thrown in the utmost consternation by the report of a pistol fired from a thickly planted part of the shrubbery which Charles and his companion had just passed. He fell instantly, and it was found that he had been wounded in the leg. One of the party was a medical man. His assistance was immediately given, and on examining, he declared that the injury was very slight, that no bone was broken, it was merely a flesh wound, that it would certainly be well in a few days. "We shall know more by Sunday," said Charles, as he was carried to his chamber. His wound was immediately dressed, and so slight was the inconvenience which it gave that several of his friends spent a portion of the evening in his apartment. On inquiry, it was found that the unlucky shot was fired by the poor girl I just mentioned. It was also manifest that she had aimed not at Charles, but at the destroyer of her innocence and happiness, who was walking beside him. After a fruitless search for her through the grounds, she walked into the house of her own accord, laughing and dancing, and singing wildly, and every moment exclaiming that she had at last killed Mr. Ryan. When she heard that it was Charles and not Mr. Ryan who was shot, she fell into a violent fit, out of which, after working convulsively for some time, she sprung to the door, escaped from the crowd that pursued her, and could never be taken until last night, when she was brought here, perfectly frantic, a little before our arrival. Charles' wound was thought of such little consequence that the preparations went forward as usual for the wedding entertainment on Sunday. But on Friday night he grew restless and feverish, and on Sunday, yesterday morning, felt so ill that it was deemed necessary to obtain additional medical advice. 2 physicians and a surgeon met in consultation about 12 o'clock in the day, and the dreadful intelligence was announced that unless a change, hardly hoped for, took place before night, death must happen within 24 hours after. The wound, it seems, had been too tightly bandaged, and otherwise injudiciously treated. The physicians were right in their anticipations. No favorable symptom appeared, and long before we reached the spring-house every ray of hope had vanished. The scene we witnessed on our arrival would have wrung the heart of a demon. We heard briefly at the gate that Mr. Charles was upon his deathbed. When we reached the house, the information was confirmed by the servant who opened the door. But just as we entered, we were horrified by the most appalling screams issuing from the staircase. My mother thought she heard the voice of poor Miss McCarthy and sprung forward. We followed, and on ascending a few steps of the stairs, we found a young woman in a state of frantic passion, struggling furiously with 2 men servants, whose united strength was hardly sufficient to prevent her rushing upstairs over the body of Mrs. McCarthy, who was lying in strong hysterics upon the steps. This, I afterwards discovered, was the unhappy girl I before described, who was attempting to gain access to Charles' room to get his forgiveness, as she said, before he went away to accuse her of having killed him. This wild idea was mingled with another, which seemed to dispute with the former possession of her mind. In one sentence, she called on Charles to forgive her, and the next she would denounce James Ryan as the murderer both of Charles and her. At length she was torn away. The last words I heard her scream were, "James Ryan, 'twas you killed him, and not I. 'Twas you killed him, and not I." Mrs. McCarthy, on recovering, fell into the arms of my mother, whose presence seemed a great relief to her. She wept the first tears, I was told, that she had shed since the fatal accident. She conducted us to Charles' room, who, she said, had desired to see us the moment of our arrival. As he found his end approaching, and wished to devote the last hour of his existence to unuttered prayer and meditation, we found him perfectly calm, resigned, and even cheerful. He spoke of the awful event which was at hand with courage and confidence, and treated it as a doom for which he had been preparing ever since his former remarkable illness, and which he never once doubted was truly foretold to him. He bade us farewell with the air of one who was about to travel a short and easy journey, and we left him with impressions which, notwithstanding all their anguish, which will, I trust, never entirely forsake us. Poor Mrs. McCarthy, but I'm just called away. There seems a slight stir in the family, perhaps. The above letter was never finished. The enclosure to which it more than once alludes told the sequel briefly, and it is all that I have further learned of the family of McCarthy before the sun had gone down upon Charles' 27th birthday. His soul had gone to render its last account to its creator. Let's see. Let's see, how are we doing currently? I think we'll have to call it for right now. We've been going for a good amount of time, and my voice is getting a bit bleh. Getting a bit bleh. So, better call it. But I hope you'll enjoy.
Oh my god!
But I hope you'll enjoyed the reading, and I hope you'll be able to join it next time.